So people, welcome! Today we're going to be doing something extremely important, and that is pixel peep. We're going to be pixel peeping. That's really important stuff, not like that waste of time like going out and actually taking pictures or studying photography or buying photo books and seeing what the greats do. Nah, that's nonsense, that's silly talk. Today we're going to be looking at pixels and making educated guesses on which pixel is the prettiest. My name is Radu, welcome to 1000 Words. Every time you're going to be seeing a new video from me on the channel, in the foreseeable future anyway, the hair is gonna be crazier and crazier until it gets insufferable enough that I cut it. But until that day comes, I'm sticking with my decision to grow it long. Today we're going to be comparing oranges to oranges and apples to apples. We have the Pentax SMC version, the Pentax M 50mm f1.4, the Canon FD 50mm f1.4, the SSC variant, and the Konica Hexanon AR 50mm f1.4. We're going to be doing a fast 50 comparison. Now, I'm going to be eating my own words, touching upon a claim I made in a previous video where I said one can never have enough 50s. I recently started thinking about a couple of 50mm lenses I own that get very little use. Take the Konica. I last used it 12 months ago. Yeah, that's a year ago. And before that, I last used it months ago. I last used the Canon in summer, this being pretty much the tail end of December, so that's almost half a year ago. What good is a lens I don't use? Practically none. But before I sell two of these lenses, stick around till the end to see exactly which two are getting sold. Actually, one of them has just left. I sent the package earlier today, so one of them has already been sold, but I did decide to sell two of them and keep one of them, especially seeing how I also have a Zuiko 50mm f1.4 en route to me. I found a good deal last week and I just couldn't resist it. And I thought about it. 4 fast 50s is quite a lot. And seeing how I don't really have money lying around, I thought I'd recoup some money, pass some lenses forward to perhaps somebody that might give them more use, and keep those I actually like using. Now, before moving on to the computer and doing the actual pixel peeping, because yeah, that's why you're here, every photographer worth his salt should always be doing pixel peeping instead of actually taking photographs. Before all that, I want to ask you to kindly consider supporting my work here. If you enjoy the content on this channel, there are several ways in which you can support me and tell me you enjoy this. First and foremost, the most helpful thing you can do is by far clicking the like button. The number of likes of a video is how the YouTube algorithm decides to push a video onto new potential users. So by far, that's the most helpful thing you can do. You can also subscribe in order to be able to be notified on future uploads and see just how wild my hair can get. Comment down below and tell me what you think about all of this. I do assure you I read every single one of your comments, even if I don't answer to all of them. If you're so inclined and feeling generous, there's also a buy me a coffee and a PayPal link down below where you can throw a buck or two down my way. Much appreciated. It will go towards my beer fund and I will be raising a glass in your health. That said, we're going to be switching over to the computer and see what is what. While I don't claim this is an uber scientific test, I did try to create an equal playing field for these lenses in order to be able to make an accurate determination of which lens performs best and how they differ. Consequently, I've shot multiple sets of 3 images in different scenarios. And while I will try to mention which image is taken by which lens, you will always be able to check out this information box here and see for yourself. All these images are shot at the exact same settings for each scenario, and you will also be able to judge that by looking at the settings here in the top left corner. All images are shot as JPEGs with a Sony a7R Mark II with its default standard creative profiles. So, and also might be worth mentioning, all these lenses are here, not processed on. And also, as far as post-processing goes, there has been none whatsoever applied to any of them. They have just been demosaiced by the processing software here, and other than that, they're just displayed using the neutral profile, so nothing at all as far as sharpening or contrast or exposure. They're very much vanilla, straight out of camera JPEGs. You will see variations in exposure later on, and I will touch upon this a bit later, but please rest assured I triple checked these images were all taken with the exact same settings. So let's start. First set of images is where I went for a general look on the color, rendition, image sharpness, contrast, and all images are shot wide open, focused at around 5 meters, that's 15 feet for all you weirdos out there, still using the Imperial system. Judging the overall image quality, it's decently sharp as far as wide open fast 50s go, colors are nice, and center sharpness is rather lacking. It's pretty soft at that. However, not terrible, certainly usable. Colors are nice and lively, pleasant at that. Contrast is very decent, if nothing spectacular. 100% in the corner reveals pretty grim story. It's terribly soft, very smudgy, lots of chromatic aberrations, really smeared. Check out these chromatic aberrations here. Really smeared, really smudgy, very soft, pretty bad to be fair. But hey, most vintage fast 50s are unsharp in the corners, so your mileage may vary, but this is pretty much unsurprising. Moving on to the second lens, the Canon. This is where we start noticing the fact that the Canon is kind of sharp. Quite sharp wide open. In the center at least, it's pretty much great. Surprisingly so, considering this is wide open. Colors are really nice and lively, pleasant to look at, decently saturated, as is the contrast. Moving on to the corners, there's a noticeable decrease in sharpness, also some noticeable chromatic aberrations, but nothing compared to the Pentax earlier. If soft, really quite a bit sharper than the Pentax. There are parts where it's quite good, but generally pretty soft in the corners. And the Konica, we start to see a color rendition difference, and this will become a recurring theme later on. Colors are warmer, and to my eye at least, they seem more pleasant. I enjoy a warmer tone as far as colors go in my images, so I find this more preferable than the other two, which admittedly seem to render more lifelike, more neutral, more accurate. Center sharpness is pretty lacking as well. Let's compare it to the Pentax. About, if not slightly softer. It does appear the Konica is slightly softer. Well, actually considerably softer, wide open, than the Pentax, and certainly so much softer than the Canon. Moving on to the corners, they're really kind of better than the Canon and much better than the Pentax. Corners are soft but behave nicely and decently. There's very little in the way of chromatic aberrations, just the tiniest amount of smudging and smearing. Corners are indeed soft, but really much better than expected and much more in line with what we get in the center. It appears the Konica handles quite good overall images. Nice, I would say a bit more contrasty than the other two. Much livelier, much warmer, and generally with a better color representation than the other two. Moving on to the next set of three, where we judged the same scene shot at f8. It's here where most lenses shine, if not all of them. There is hardly any lens that's bad at f8, and this proves to be the case as well for the Pentax. Center sharpness is really fantastic. Crisp, very detailed, excellent resolution, very good colors, great contrast, pretty much bang on. Moving on into the corners, they're pretty great as well, except for the tiniest amount of softness in the most extreme part of the image here. Just the most extreme edges seem to suffer from a little softness here. Just a handful of pixels in this corner here as well. It appears to be pretty much perfect, with the exception of the very far corners of the image. Moving on to the Canon, and we start to see something very interesting. Check out the waveform here, and switching back to the Pentax, back to the Canon. Let me switch to the histogram and switch back to the Pentax and the Konica. They are both almost a full stop darker than the Pentax. Now, why is that? I'm not sure, but I have a hunch. I will talk about this later. Judging center sharpness at 100%, this is the Canon. Bitingly sharp, perfect detail, excellent resolution. This is pretty much razor sharpness right here. Corners are perfect, no trace of any sort of smearing or smudges or softness. Any sort of optical imperfection is gone by now. Image is perfect. Very contrasty, very pleasant colors, really great as far as image rendition goes. Moving on to the Konica, we notice again the warmer tones, and what we start to notice, we look closer, is a more detailed gradation of tones. I find the Konica to render colors much more precisely, and I already can say the Konica is the better of the three as far as color rendition goes. Colors are really great. There's just a really great deal of richness to the tones. There's just a vast amount of tonal variety. Sharpness is pretty good, but still noticeably less sharp than the Canon and about on equal footing with the Pentax. Corners are great as well. Sharpness is bang on, resolution is great, details are awesome. The lens performs splendidly at f8. Moving on to the next set of 3 images where we shoot at infinity, wide open again, judging overall color, contrast, saturation, and we already notice the very apparent vignetting. This is the Pentax at infinity. It appears to be quite soft, but if we zoom in at 100%, the edges are pretty defined. Sharpness is decent at least, but what isn't decent is the pretty terrible fringing. There's quite a bit of chromatic aberrations here, a lot of purple fringing around these high contrast areas. Terrible softness in the corners. Pretty bad. Overall, colors are true to life, accurate, if perhaps slightly on the colder side. Moving on to the Canon, the vignetting seems to be even more pronounced. The image seems to be a hair sharper. Zoom out completely, and zooming in at 100%, it's noticeably sharper. There's also apparently quite a bit more as far as fringing goes. This is pretty wild here. This is kind of like a doubling of this edge here. Pretty bad as far as chromatic aberrations. Corners are soft, but not as soft as the Pentax. Generally, the image is okay. Now, the Konica, last of this set, is kind of soft, wide open again. However, it handles chromatic aberrations great. There's just the tiniest amount of purple fringing, barely even noticeable, certainly not noticeable at full zoomed out, but zoomed in completely at 100%, it's there, but it's just barely noticeable. Corners are predictably soft. The Konica seems to have a gentle softness to it, a softness that almost doesn't appear to be a flaw, but rather a feature of this lens. Judging softness wide open, in the corners at least, with the Pentax, which the Pentax is sharper in the center, but in the corners it's just terrible. There's a mess here. The smudginess is really terrible, pretty gross actually. And checking the corners on the Konica, there seems to be a more tame, a more restrained softness, not as egregious as the Pentax. The colors are again warmer, but this is already something we established, so by now it's no surprise. Pretty strong as far as contrast goes. Pleasant image. I think it delivers the best contrast out of the 3 wide open. Same scene shot at f8. The Pentax is very sharp, even zoomed out completely, and zooming in, it's tack sharp. Check these power lines, check the edges here. It's really sharp. These branches appear to be less so. because they're really close. The focusing is here on Infinity, and these branches are, what, like maybe 8 or 10 meters away, so critical sharpness is not achieved here, but rather here at Infinity. However, image is decently, what am I saying? Image is perfectly sharp. Really no trace of any sort of aberrations. Even the tiny birds here, there are just a couple of pixels in size. They're just really detailed. Everything is crisp. Moving on to the Canon, we see the loss in brightness yet again. It would appear the Pentax is the brighter of the lenses when shot at f8. Now, why is that? Now, the Pentax have quite a bit of a renown as far as coatings go. Their super multi coatings are supposed to be some of the best in the business. And I have a hunch this is why the Pentax is quite a bit brighter. It seems to allow quite a bit more light to come in. Due to their coatings, I think, I want to underline that, I think the Pentax achieves a better light transmission coefficient, but that's just a hunch, a guess on my side, nothing scientific. If you have any idea, please comment down below and tell me why the Canon and the Konica are considerably, almost a stop, like 2/3 of a stop darker than the Pentax. Moving on. The Canon is really, really sharp. Again, very, very good detail, perfect resolution, no trace of any sort of optical imperfections, no chromatic aberrations, no fringing anywhere. Sharpness is great. Contrast is excellent, very lifelike. The Pentax was a little on the bluish side. The Canon seems to be very, very accurate, and the Konica is, again, very unsurprisingly so, quite a lot warmer. Perhaps, well, rather, certainly due to the thorium rare metal in the optical elements. The Konica is a radioactive lens, and that in turn makes for a yellowish hue in time. Sharpness is not as great as on the Canon, and perhaps not even as great as the Pentax. It's the same elegant, gentle sharpness I talked about earlier. It is sharp. This is really, really great sharpness. Very detailed edges. Resolution is great. But it seems to be more restrained. It seems to be more elegant, more refined as far as sharpness goes. The Canon is just like brute sharpness. The Pentax is just sharp. And the Konica seems to be like a gentleman as far as sharpness goes. Really, I think it's down to the coatings they use, because Konica is also famous for their coatings. And the sharpness the Konica produces at f8 seems to be very, very restrained and elegant. I'm repeating myself already, but I just want to drive this point home. Very, very pleasant. Very characterful. Also, the darkest of the bunch. All are shot at the exact same settings as far as exposure goes. And while you are seeing f0 here, I assure you I triple checked on my lens and they're all shot at f8. At first I thought I made a mistake. I went back and triple checked my settings because I found this difference in brightness very surprising. Moving on, judging the quality of the blur. Focus was achieved here on this crack in the tree bark, and we're interested to see the out of focus blur. The Pentax is very, very soft. Creaminess in spades. Very, very smooth. Excellent. Just goes to show why it's so famous for its background blur. Everything in the background melts in an amorphous mass of shape and color. Moving on to the Canon, it's again, even at f1.4 apparently in some conditions, a hair darker than the Pentax. Background blur is pretty pleasant as well. Sharpness is noticeably better, but the background blur is pretty close to the Pentax, which is this one. A tiny bit more defined as far as edges go on these bokeh balls here, but other than that, it's there. It's perfect smoothness, very creamy, very soft. And finally, the Konica, which appears to be the more characterful of the bunch. Edges are even more defined. The blur is pretty, but it appears to be somewhat harsher, a bit more defined. Sharpness is not as good as the other two. Overall, it's pretty great, but if we're judging by the quality of the background blur, the Pentax takes the cake. Moving on to the next set of three, where we judge the quality of the bokeh. First up is the Pentax. Quite unsurprisingly so already, the background blur and bokeh quality is just amazing. Perfect smoothness, just great all around, really great colors. Everything is smooth, everything is buttery and creamy. However, there's quite a bit of green fringing and some purple fringing. This is shot almost, but not quite into the sun, so pretty difficult shooting conditions. Harsh contrast the edges here, so the green fringing is to be expected, but it is quite terrible actually. It is easily fixable in post, but unprocessed, there's quite a bit of fringing here. Other than that, softness is great, and it just looks like magic. It's really fantastic. Moving on to the Canon, which is again a bit more defined in the edges here. Bokeh seems to be a hair busier. There's just the tiniest amount of difference, but it's noticeable. Also, the fringing appears to be somewhat worse than the Pentax. Overall, the image is a bit reddish, and I would say the Pentax is the most accurate as far as white balance goes, followed by the Canon, and lastly, the Konica, which is quite considerably warmer than the others, but to my eye at least, it's got the best colors. We can see the vast amount of color gradation. Again, there's just appears to be an infinite amount of tonal variation. The transition from greens to oranges, all these shades of yellow and green. There's just a majestic way in which this lens appears to be rendering color. There's just fantastic. Just check out this part here. It looks like something out of a sci-fi movie. The bokeh is quite more nervous, a bit busier than I'd like, but characterful and not over the top. It's not bad, but if we're judging the smoothness, the Pentax is the smoothest, and this is the least smooth of them all. However, yet again, the Konica deals with difficult lighting conditions gloriously. There's the slightest amount of green fringing, practically almost no purple fringing at all. The Konica coatings are doing an excellent job in controlling chromatic aberrations. Really pleasant, by far my favorite as far as colors go. And moving on to the last set of three, where we judge how these lenses perform shooting straight into the sun. We're looking for flares, we're looking for loss of contrast, we're looking for ghosting and any sorts of optical defects apparent when shooting lenses straight into a strong source of light. And the Pentax has quite a bit of green fringing, a lot of purple fringing. However, contrast is pretty strong. There's just a bit of flaring here, And although I would have liked it to be more defined, I mean, if you're gonna flare, just flare like the Konica 40mm does, just flare and give me a good flare. This, it's a bit less characterful than I'd like. Overall, smoothness is great, contrast is decent, there's not a lot of ghosting, some purple fringing here on the far top part of the image, but overall it's not a bad image as far as shot straight into the sun images go. The Canon is disappointingly bad. There's this big flare here. It's not defined enough to be used creatively. However, it's defined enough in order to almost ruin your images. Purple fringing here, quite a bit of ghosting, significant loss of contrast. I suspect this is a single coated lens. It's a pretty old lens. It's the SSC variant, and wrapping things up with the Konica, pretty great contrast. I would dare say slightly better than the Pentax. Yeah, quite a bit better than the Pentax. And zooming in at 100%, there is some purple fringing, there is some green fringing, some chromatic aberrations, but compared to the Pentax, it's nothing as egregious. Just look at this mess. This is the Pentax. It's a mess here. It looks like goo. It looks like oily and pretty terrible. The Canon is pretty much the same, if not worse, and the Konica is quite a bit better. The Konica coatings seem to be handling these tough conditions pretty great. There's no two ways about it. Each and single one of these lenses is great. Now, any differences as far as color rendition, sharpness, image quality in general are only apparent in a side-by-side comparison, and this is not something you should be wasting your time with. I did this because I enjoy geeking out with gear, and so that you don't have to. You should just go out and take actual photographs, improve your craft, use your feet to go out there, experience the world, take photos, elevate your craft, learn, experience stuff. Now, that said, as far as differences go, each of these lenses has a strong suit. The Pentax has the prettiest, smoothest depth of field blur and the most beautiful bokeh. The Canon is the sharpest of the bunch, and the Konica is just amazing in the way that it is able to render a wide variety of tones. It's really great in the way it renders colors. The famous Konica coatings really show their strength here. It's amazing also in the way that it handles tough shooting conditions. However, the Konica, at least the copy I own, which is a pretty solid copy, seems to be the less sharp of the bunch. That said, I am going to be keeping the Pentax. So why am I choosing to keep the Pentax? It's because it's small, it's light, it's compact, and it's really pleasant to use. Now, as far as looks go, and I'm touching upon this because it's something I enjoy a lot. I've mentioned this before, I like pretty lenses. The Pentax is the most common of the bunch. The Konica is the coolest, is the sleekest, is the most elegant, followed closely by the Canon. But I'm keeping the Pentax because it's the lightest, it's the smallest, it's the most compact, and I've come to value these things a lot more than the slightest of differences in image quality that some other lenses might have. Now, your mileage may vary. There might be differences between copies and copies. Your preferences might be different, but this is my take on the whole thing. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I bid you farewell. This has been Radu, and this has been 1000 Words.